Good Tuesday morning and Happy New Year. Steve Goldstein in for Mike Broomhead today on the Mike Broomhead Show. Special shout out to folks listening in Litchfield Park. Thanks so much for listening to 92.3 KTAR. Joined again by Roy Herrera, attorney and former congressional staffer who is in D.C. at the moment. Roy, I wanted to ask you about the cycles, political cycles, as it were, because you mentioned President Obama earlier. When he won, there was this feeling, and James Carville said it, that Democrats would dominate the day for at least a couple generations probably. And then the feeling is that, when Trump won in 2016, had that completely transformed the country. In some ways it has, obviously. But do you look at it this way? Do you look at it, again, can you be optimistic that this is going to be short? People used to make the joke about the fever breaking. Are you concerned that this is going to be, this type of conservatism, this type of populism is going to last in Arizona, for example? Or is it something that, could last for one more House cycle, and then we'll just see?
I tend to view things in cycles as you sort of outlined, because that's just been sort of the political history of the last, 20 years, if not longer, where, a political party wins maybe one election cycle or maybe a couple in a row, like the Democrats, I think, won a couple in a row, like in 2020 and 2022. But then it flips. It flips back to the other party. And I think there's, a lot of reasons for that. I think in sort of recent years, the main reason for that, quite frankly, I think, is that there are a lot of voters that just are dissatisfied with the results. They vote for a particular party to have control because they think that, that party is going to enact policies that help them, and then they are essentially disappointed. And so they change their mind and they say, okay, well, we want, the other party to control things. And so in that sense, if you're opposed to Trump, or if you're a Democrat, obviously I'm a Democrat, I think there's reasons for optimism in the sense that, in 2026, that's probably going to be a pretty good election cycle, if you look at history, because, there are going to be a lot of people, I think, that, aren't quite satisfied with Trump, because it's impossible, I think, for, any president, whether it be Democrat or Republican, to sort of deliver on all their promises. And so I think you will see a shift back to the Democrats, and so on and so forth, I think, for, probably the rest of my adulthood, because that's the situation that we're in. And so I know there's a lot of people that are saying, okay, well, this is a new permanent Republican majority in Arizona or nationally, and that's just not really supported by history, at least, again, history in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah. Right, I'm a civil discussion, reach across the aisle kind of guy. And I know that gets harder and harder, certainly in the last decade or so. Is there room there even for things that could specifically help Arizona? Are there things that Senator-elect Gallego wants to focus on where he could see himself, even as he wants to fight the Trump agenda, where he could actually work with folks on the other side of the aisle?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's going to be his goal. And I view the world similar to you, Steve, in that, it's almost essential, I think, for there to be some bipartisan work on issues. I mean, that's the only way, I think, particularly in the kind of environment that I've been describing, that you actually get anything done that's permanent. And so when you look at the issues, I think that, somebody like a Senator-elect Gallego can maybe work and reach across the aisle on. I mean, there's going to be things like, how do we reduce the cost of living, whether that be sort of everyday costs or things like housing, where I think there's some commonality. And in a state like Arizona, where our water future is so important, I think that's another area where that's just going to require, Republicans and Democrats working with each other in Arizona and federally and regionally. And I know that's something that he's very much going to be focused on. So there are going to be things, I think, that, where it's possible for the two sides to come together on potential, legislation. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot of things that, that's simply just not going to be possible, right? And I look at things like, tariffs, for example, where I think there's a consensus, certainly on the Democratic side, and certainly I think with economists and the business community, that tariffs would be really bad, right? That they would lead to higher prices in a state like Arizona. And in a state like Arizona, where our number one trade partner is Mexico, something like tariffs would be a terrible thing, I think, for the economy and the development of the state. So you have to pick and choose, I think, your battles. I think no one's effective if they just say, I'm never going to listen to the other side at all and just be the opposition. And that's certainly, really just not possible in D.C. right now, where, the Republicans are going to control both chambers and the presidency.
Well, yeah, take us behind the curtain that a little bit, Roy, from a not necessarily your feeling personal about it, but friends, colleagues who happen to be on the left side of the aisle, because we saw what happened for a lot of folks in 2016. I mean, I had people who I worked with who did not want to go to work the next day after Donald Trump became president for the first time. How do people who are in your philosophical area get up the next day to decide to either be optimistic or to fight or whatever? Are you finding that in some ways, not to put words in your mouth, but that because Trump is not an unknown quantity this time, that people are, they sort of know how they want to direct things as opposed to it feeling like a tsunami just hit them?
Well, I think there's something to be said about, we're a couple months away from the election now, right? So I think there certainly people, friends, of sort of my political persuasion did feel like a tsunami had hit them, certainly the day after the election or the weeks after the election, when everything was just so fresh. And I'm sure there's people that still feel that way, but I think sort of that feeling has lessened a little bit because, reality hits. And certainly if you're involved in politics or, you at least follow it closely, I think you recognize that, like, okay, well, now we have to actually, get stuff done one way or the other. And we have to work under this new paradigm, this new reality. And that's where I think you pick, as kind of I was saying, you sort of pick the fights that you want to fight. And it could be a whole lot of fights. And I imagine it's going to be a whole lot of fights. Yeah. The Democrats are going to be picking with President-elect Trump. But then again, if there are areas of commonality or, even if it's small, discrete policy issues or issue areas, you got to pursue that. But you always have to fight. There is an element, though, as you mentioned, that Trump is a known quantity. So this isn't quite, this is me talking more personally now, but this isn't quite as much of a surprise, I guess, emotionally to me as 2016 was. And so in that sense, I don't know if that's good or bad, but I think it sort of has led at least myself to say, okay, this is sad to me, but we have to do something and we have to continue working because people in Arizona expect it.
And Roy, before we let you go, I have to ask a very direct political question, which is totally not fair, but it's one of those, hey, it's New Year's Eve, so let me just throw it out to you. In Arizona specifically, do you think that Katie Hobbs is going to face a serious primary challenger in 2026 for governor in Arizona?
I do not. And I think, there's a number of reasons why. One reason, I think, is that, I don't think that she is in a politically weakened position where such a primary campaign would be necessary or successful. I think basically what I'm saying is that, I think her approval numbers are pretty good. And I think she's, obviously going to have this legislative session coming up where hopefully a lot gets done. And so she's just not in a weakened position. And on top of that, I think there's a structural question, which is that it really is impossible to take on, almost impossible, I should say. Nothing's impossible, but almost impossible to take somebody on, an incumbent in a primary and beat them of your own party. It just doesn't happen. And I just don't think it's going to happen this time. I fully expect the three statewide Democrats to run for re-election for their own races. And as I mentioned earlier, again, conventional wisdom will say that the 2026 midterms will be pretty good for Democrats, including probably in Arizona, because, again, there will be sort of that backlash to the initial 2 years of President Trump.
Okay. And Roy Herrera, last few seconds, you're in D.C. for New Year's Eve. What are you going to do? Well,
I think we'll see. There'll be some celebrations. There'll be some champagne. Maybe some resolutions, that kind of thing. New Year's Eve has never been sort of my favorite holiday, or certainly one that I like to think about quite a bit, but it's been a very good year. Lucky in a lot of ways. And so hopefully I can sort of count those blessings tonight and have a good time.
Terrific. Attorney and former congressional staffer Roy Herrera, always good to connect with you. Roy, thanks and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching the Mike Broomhead Show. Catch up on Amazing Arizonans, a KTAR News podcast, and click the button in the middle to subscribe.